They say the river only rises when it's ready to teach a lesson. I knew that better than anyone in our quiet little subdivision by the levee. While most of my neighbors were fussing over lawn edging and HOA-approved mailbox paint, I was watching the sky, the forecast, and the river gauges upstream. I'd lived here for 6 years. Bought the place cash after retiring from the Army Corps of Engineers. It wasn't fancy, a modest one-story home tucked on the last lot before the neighborhood curved away from the slope that led down to the river. But it was mine. And I chose this spot deliberately. I loved the sound of water. It reminded me of places I'd worked in Louisiana and Tennessee, flood zones mostly. Disaster sites, where I saw people lose everything they thought couldn't be taken from them. So when the alerts started buzzing that Monday morning National Weather Service, predicting 8 to 12 inches of rain in the next 72 hours, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I pulled the flood barriers from my garage. Not sandbags, though I had plenty of those too, but real interlocking modular barriers. Steel reinforced, bought secondhand from a county surplus sale years ago. I laid them down in a half-moon pattern, starting at the back edge of my property line, arcing forward, hugging the slope between my yard and the line where the HOA-maintained greenbelt began. The barriers weren't on their land, not an inch. I made sure of that. Still, I saw her. Karen. Her name really was Karen. Karen Delaney, HOA board president for the past 3 years. A woman with hair the color of raw corn silk and the jaw of a pit bull in pearls. She was standing at the edge of the greenbelt, arms folded, lips pressed tight, like she'd just bitten into something sour. She didn't wave, just stared. I kept working, dropping the anchors, checking the bolts. I'd installed dozens of these things in worse terrain. Iraq, Missouri, coastal North Carolina, always under pressure, always with lives at stake. By mid-afternoon, the barriers were mostly in place. My property had a clear channel for overflow, runoff lined with gravel and culverts I maintained myself. I didn't ask the HOA to pay for it. I didn't file permits. I just handled it, quietly, responsibly. When I walked back around to the front yard, she was waiting for me at the end of the driveway. "You can't install industrial barricades on residential property," she said before I'd even made it halfway to her. That violates Covenant Section 4.3 regarding unauthorized modifications visible from public or common areas. I wiped the sweat off my forehead. It's on my land. "You've disrupted the visual harmony of the slope," she continued, voice clipped chin high. "It's visible from the walking trail. That's a common space." I looked past her toward the trail winding asphalt, half buried in yellowing grass. No one used it, except dog walkers and bored teenagers on scooters. "There's a flood warning, Karen," I said calmly. "This isn't decorative, it's preventative. And if everyone in the neighborhood decided to erect eyesores because of their personal paranoia, what would happen to property values?" she snapped. "This community has standards." I should have walked away. I know that now. But I'd seen what happens when pride wins over preparation, and I'd seen it too many times to keep silent anymore. "Floods don't care about your standards," I said, voice low. "They don't read your covenants. And when the water comes, and it will, you'll be glad someone had the sense to build a wall." She stared at me like I'd just challenged her to a duel. "We'll see what the board has to say." And with that, she pivoted on one kitten heel and marched back to her golf cart, the electric motor whining as she zipped off toward the clubhouse. That night, I got the first letter hand-delivered to my door in a bright white envelope stamped, "Urgent." Inside was a citation, unauthorized structural alteration, non-compliant materials, and visual obstruction. 36 hours to remove all barriers or face escalating daily fines. It would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the river levels, but I also listened for the low rumble, the groan of earth giving way, the moment the rain turned from nuisance to nightmare. The rain started around 3 a.m. light at first, whispering against the roof like a lullaby meant for someone else. But I could feel the heaviness in the air. The ground was already wet from a previous week of showers. The river wouldn't hold for long. By sunrise, I was outside again, tightening bolts, checking seams reinforcing the south curve. And that's when I saw the drone. It buzzed overhead, quiet, sleek, HOA issued. Karen liked to use it to monitor community compliance. I raised a hand to wave. Let her watch. Let her see how far I was willing to go. She didn't understand what it meant to lose everything. She hadn't stood waist-deep in black water, carrying an old woman out of her crumbling home, feeling the current rip past your knees, and knowing there were bodies floating in that same stream a few streets over. But I had. I never wanted to again, so I worked. Even as the wind picked up, even as the HOA threats started arriving faster than the clouds, and all the while the river kept rising. By Tuesday morning, the rain had shifted from steady to relentless. The kind that didn't bother to fall in drops anymore, but in curtains. My gutters overflowed despite being cleaned out just last week, and the channels I dug along the yard's perimeter gurgled under the strain. I stood on my porch, soaked to the knees and clutching a thermos of lukewarm coffee, watching the gray sky sag like an overfilled ceiling. That's when I heard it, footsteps on wet concrete, quick and deliberate. I turned and saw Travis on the HOA Compliance Committee approaching under a branded umbrella. His poncho clung to him like cellophane, and his usual cocky bounce was missing from his gait. He held out a waterproof folder like it might bite him. "I'm just the messenger," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. I took the folder. Inside, a second violation notice, this one with sharper teeth. Failure to comply with the initial citation. Immediate removal of all non-HOA approved flood barriers required. Daily fines of $300 to commence as of 900 a.m. Attached was a glossy full-color printout of my property taken from the drone. Red circles outlined the barriers. Another document listed escalating consequences, beginning with fines, then lien placement, and finally the potential for court action if I didn't restore the property's aesthetic conformity. I stared at the paper for a full minute before speaking. "Travis," I said slowly, "you see what's happening here, right?" He shifted his weight, glanced at the culvert where water already lapped close to the edge. "I'm not saying I agree," he mumbled, "but the board voted unanimously. Karen's been adamant." "She ever talk about the flood of '96, I asked. He blinked. "Know why? Because it ripped through this valley like a freight train. 26 homes lost, 3 people dead. My brother was one of them. He was 10. His eyes widened. He opened his mouth, then shut it. "I've spent the last 25 years studying this stuff, building barriers, working with FEMA. I didn't put that wall up because I'm paranoid, Travis. I put it up because the soil's already saturated, the river's up 6 feet in 2 days, and the slope behind this neighborhood acts like a funnel." A beat of silence passed between us, just long enough for thunder to roll in from the west. "I'll pass that along," he said quietly, and turned back toward the road. I didn't expect him to do anything. Not really. Karen ran the HOA like a private kingdom. The rest of the board were just courtiers, some scared of her, others hoping to be her next pick for vice president. The idea that someone with actual experience, who didn't attend monthly mixers or obsess over fence paint, might know better. That didn't sit well with her vision. Still, I hoped, just a little. By noon, the storm intensified. Sheets of rain blurred the edges of everything: my driveway, the mailbox, even the black and gold HOA sign at the subdivision entrance. I checked the river gauge every hour, 7 feet above normal. Then 8, then 8.5. At noon, I drove down to the clubhouse. I wasn't planning to confront anyone. I just needed to talk to someone who'd listen, someone I could reason with. Maybe even explain the risk in terms they could understand. The lot was half flooded already, water pooling in tire tracks. I parked by the fire lane and made my way inside where the board was mid-meeting. Karen sat at the head of the long walnut table, bone dry and poised with 2 cups of untouched espresso beside her. 4 other board members flanked her, scribbling notes or looking nervously at tablets. She saw me and didn't flinch. "This is a private meeting," she said, voice crisp. "I know," I replied, "but you need to hear this." A low murmur spread among the members. One of them, Nancy, I think, gestured toward the window. "It's getting worse out there. I've reinforced my barrier twice today," I said. "Water's creeping into the slope faster than it should. If that line breaks, and I mean the one you ordered, remove, this neighborhood will be the first thing it takes." Karen clicked her pen once, twice. "I've reviewed your so-called engineering project. It's unsightly. It's non-compliant. It's a liability. It's functional," I said. "And it's legal. It's entirely on my property, with no structural connection to HOA-maintained land. You've got no grounds to demand its removal under municipal code." She stood, slowly. "I'll have our legal counsel clarify that," she said. "But in the meantime, we expect compliance. And frankly, it's disturbing that a resident would exploit weather panic to justify rogue construction." I stared at her. She believed that. She truly did. "You think this is about optics?" I asked. You think water gives a damn about compliance. She didn't answer. I turned to leave. Before I reached the door, she added, if you do not remove those barriers by morning, the board will authorize their removal for you. There it was. The line in the sand. Only this time it wasn't sand, it was silt mud. And soon enough, river. I drove home in silence, windshield wipers working overtime. Every part of me ached not from the work, but from the weight of history repeating itself. That night I stayed awake. I just watched the river levels, but listening. For the low rumble. The groan of earth giving way. The moment the rain turned from nuisance to nightmare. I had a sinking feeling in my gut, not from fear, from certainty. The storm didn't let up. By dawn, Wednesday, the rain wasn't just falling. It was battering the land, soaking every pore of earth until it had no choice but to spit the water back out. My backyard had become a shallow lagoon. The gravel channels overwhelmed, despite my best efforts. But the barriers, they held, for now. I stood by the window, hands clasped behind my back, watching the water surge against the base of the wall. The steel plates groaned, but didn't move. I knew what that sound meant. I'd heard it before once in the summer of 1996, standing knee-deep in a river that didn't used to be there. It was a week like this back then. I was 17. My little brother Tommy was 10. We'd been tossing a football in the front yard of our home in rural Kentucky when the first wave hit. I still remember the sound, a sickening snap as the old levee cracked, followed by the roar of water coming like it had a grudge against the earth. It swept through our town in under an hour. I remembered grabbing Tommy's hand and trying to drag him toward higher ground, but he slipped. The mud pulled him under like quicksand. I never saw him again. 3 days later, they found his body 15 miles downriver, caught in a pile of uprooted trees. That was the day I stopped trusting luck and started trusting structure. I didn't talk about Tommy. Not with neighbors. Not even with my ex-wife when we were still married. But every trench I dug, every culvert I reinforced, every barrier I bolted to the ground, it was all because of him. So when Karen dismissed my work as paranoid and unsightly, it cut deeper than she could have known. She didn't see what I saw every time I heard rain pounding the roof. She didn't hear my mother's screams when they told us Tommy was gone. But I heard them. They came back now as the wind howled against the siding and thunder rolled across the hills like cannon fire. At 7:45 a.m., I got a call from Jason, my old friend from the county flood response team. He was already out with a crew 2 towns over where a retention wall had given way near a nursing home. It's gonna get worse before it gets better, he said, shouting over the engine. You still got those old Zodiac boats in the garage. You might need them. I hung up and immediately pulled the boats from their racks, rigid inflatables, ex-military, easy to deploy, and strong as hell. I had fuel, radios, flares. I always kept my gear maintained. Not because I was paranoid, because I was prepared. Around 9 a.m., I saw the first sign of trouble beyond my fence line. The slope leading from my backyard to the HOA greenbelt had begun to shimmer, not from water, but from movement. The kind of slow, almost imperceptible slide that precedes collapse. Saturated soil had begun to shift, and the barriers were the only thing keeping it from tearing loose entirely. I called the city's flood control office, left a message. Then I texted Travis. Me, barriers holding, but slope is unstable. Advise HOA to sandbag east trail. Urgent. Travis. I'll tell them. Karen's pushing for removal today. That last line made me freeze. She wasn't bluffing. She was really going to send people to dismantle the only thing standing between her neighborhood and disaster. I grabbed my coat, yanked open the front door, and there she was. Karen standing in the rain umbrella, clenched like a sword, 2 HOA contractors behind her in yellow slickers, holding bolt cutters and crowbars. We're giving you a chance to cooperate, she said, lips pursed, mascara already smudging from the downpour. This isn't a fence, I said. It's a flood wall. You dismantle it and people will drown. That structure is the only thing keeping this slope from collapsing into your employer's kitchen. She was silent for a moment. Then, in a voice soaked in practiced calm, she said, let the record reflect that Mr. Reeves has threatened the board with dissemination of unauthorized recordings and is attempting to disrupt governance under emergency conditions. The meeting resumed. They voted 5-2 to pursue legal injunction against me and file notice of property encroachment, even though there was no encroachment to speak of. It was a paper tiger, but I knew the goal wasn't the injunction. It was to break me, exhaust me, drown me in filings and fines until I gave up and caved. I left without another word. The whole drive home, the windshield wipers barely kept up. Water now ran in sheets across the pavement. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw a crack forming in the slope behind my home, right along the line where the barrier had been severed. I parked, got out, and trudged through the waterlogged grass to inspect it. Soil had shifted dramatically overnight. One more downpour and the whole section could give. And the slope didn't just lead to my backyard, it funneled runoff toward the cluster of homes that sat downhill, Karen's included. I tried texting Travis again. Slope compromised. Barrier breach worsening. Need immediate sandbagging west trail. No reply. At 4:02 p.m., I got an email. Subject line: Final notice, HOA enforcement action. The letter inside was clinical and cold. Failure to comply with HOA standards has resulted in emergency enforcement approval. HOA reserves the right to access property and remove any non-compliant materials as per covenant clauses. They were coming again. The storm was due to peak around midnight. At 4:45 p.m., I saw the county emergency alert go out. Flash flood warning upgraded to level 3. Voluntary evacuations for low-lying subdivisions. The one downstream from us had already started sandbagging their outer wall. Our neighborhood had done nothing. Nothing, because Karen insisted it would cause panic and make the neighborhood look like a disaster zone. So I did the only thing I could. I pulled my old portable radio from the shelf, tuned it to emergency frequency, and started coordinating with anyone listening. Jason patched in from 2 towns over. His crew was maxed out, but he said he could send volunteers if things got bad. I thanked him and hung up. Then I turned to my garage. Rechecked my 2 Zodiacs, fueled and ready. Flashlights, first aid kits, batteries, MREs. I laid everything out like I'd done in Afghanistan. Not because I thought I'd need them, because I knew I would. At 6:15 p.m., I stood in my backyard looking down the slope. The breach was now a gap. Water was beginning to seep through faster and more forceful than before. I reinforced what I could with sandbags, but I was one man. And the damage Karen's team had done couldn't be undone in an afternoon. I remember pausing just for a moment when I saw the porch lights flick on across the greenbelt. Karen's house. She was home. And she had no idea what was coming. The rain came down like it meant to erase everything. Not the soft kind that made you reach for coffee, or the misty sort that kissed the windows, but a brute force deluge. Thick, cold, angry sheets of water, pounding so hard you couldn't even hear your own thoughts. By the time dusk gave way to night, the slope behind my house was no longer just damp. It was bleeding mud. I had just finished laying a final line of sandbags, one last desperate attempt to channel runoff away from the breach, when I saw the headlights. Twin beams cutting across the downpour, slow and uncertain. A dark SUV rolled up to the curb across from my driveway, tires slicing through the rising street water. The passenger door opened and Travis stepped out, shielding his head with a manila folder. He jogged toward me, soaked by the time he reached my porch. "They're doing it tonight," he said breathlessly. Karen pushed it through. Emergency vote unanimous this time. Contractors are coming to finish removing what's left of your barrier. She says it's obstructing the natural runoff path now. I stared at him. What runoff path? He looked down. The one she just marked off on the HOA map. I wanted to laugh, or scream, or maybe both. There is no natural runoff path. There's a 20-foot slope aimed directly at Karen's cul-de-sac. That's the problem. She's calling it redirected water aggression. Redirected, I shook my head. She realizes water doesn't obey semantics right. I tried to argue, Travis muttered. I told them about your credentials, your deployments, the FEMA years. But she told the board that you were using military gear to intimidate neighbors, that the barriers were a threat. I turned and looked out at the slope where the rain shimmered silver under my floodlight. Water pooled at the base. The ground was already giving way in sections. Roots exposed, earth loosening. I said nothing. There wasn't anything left to say. At 8:26 p.m., the contractors arrived. 2 men, late 30s, hired hands in slickers and steel-toed boots. Their truck idled at the curb while they rolled out extension cords and unpacked tools. Karen wasn't with them, but I didn't doubt she was watching from her front window, notebook in hand, probably filing a report already. I met them at the slope's edge. "You can't be here," I told them flatly. "That barrier line's on my land." "We have an enforcement order signed by the HOA board," one of them replied. and instructions to remove all unauthorized structures. That structure is the only thing keeping this slope from collapsing into your employer's kitchen. He didn't answer, just glanced at the other guy, who pulled out bolt cutters and stepped forward. "I'm recording this," I said, raising my phone, "and I've already alerted the city. If you cut through my line, you're liable for the outcome." The man hesitated, but the other one, either bolder or dumber, kept walking. And he cut it. Not all of it, just enough. Enough to open a wedge at the deepest part of the slope. Enough to compromise the integrity of everything I'd reinforced for the last 4 days. I didn't yell, didn't curse. I just filmed. Rain blurred the lens, but you could still make out the sound, the terrible crack. As steel twisted under stress, the hollow thud as the barrier dropped sideways into the muck. Water surged into the opening like it had been waiting for the invitation. They finished within 20 minutes. Didn't even replace the barrier with sandbags. Just left the wound open, muttering something about just following orders. By 9:00 p.m., they were gone, and the slope was crying. Not a trickle now, but a steady sucking slosh of earth and runoff sliding toward the bottom. I radioed Jason, gave him my coordinates, told him what happened. "You want us to deploy?" he asked. "We're already stretched, but I can send 2 boats your way." "Not yet," I said. "Give it another hour." Because I knew the river. I'd studied its patterns. Its rage wasn't random. It built up slow and unseen, until the pressure beneath the surface turned into something monstrous. And that monster was almost here. At 10:12 p.m., the levee at Briar Bend gave out. I heard it before I saw it, like a freight train made of water ripping through the trees. I turned toward the sound flashlight in one hand, radio in the other. Then came the wind. Not the regular gusts of a storm, but hurricane-strength gusts, snapping branches, ripping gutters loose, screaming through the power lines, and then the water. It came over the slope like a black tide, swallowing the cut barrier first. My backup sandbags gave way in seconds. The compromised soil folded like wet cardboard. The breach exploded downward, carrying mud roots and debris in a roaring wave toward the homes below, including Karen's. Within minutes, the lower cul-de-sac was under 2 feet of water. The storm drains were clogged. The street became a river. And the screaming started. From my porch, I saw porch lights flicker on figures stumbling into the rain. People shouting over the wind. Cars revving, then stalling as engines flooded. A child crying. Then Karen's voice. She was outside, standing ankle-deep in floodwater, waving her arms at someone shouting for help. I didn't move. Not yet. I waited for her to look up the hill. Toward the house she tried to find. Toward the man she tried to crush under policy and pettiness. And when her eyes met mine, lit by the glow of my emergency floodlights, I saw it. Recognition. Fear. Regret. Then the power in the neighborhood went out. Total blackout, except for my house. I'd prepped for that too. And now I walked into the garage, opened the bay door, and fired up the Zodiac. The river had come. The Zodiac's engine sputtered for a few seconds, before catching with a deep, gurgling growl. I had fueled it hours earlier, double-checked the motor, tested the emergency beacon, and packed supplies, rope blankets, water, 2 high-beam flashlights, and a medkit. Old habits never die, especially when you've lived through the worst. By the time I eased the boat out onto the flooded street, the water had risen over the curb and was licking the steps of front porches. Cars sat half-submerged, their alarm systems wailing in disjointed symphonies as rain poured over windshields. The blacktop was no longer visible. The neighborhood had become a basin, shallow, wide, and rising. I maneuvered slowly, at first flashlight sweeping across the darkness. Branches floated like driftwood. A toppled recycling bin rolled across a lawn. In the eerie glow of my portable floodlight mounted on the prow, silhouettes moved behind windows of residents, unsure whether to stay or flee, frozen in that familiar paralysis of disbelief. And then I heard it. "Help! Oh my God, someone please!" The voice was shrill, choked with panic. I turned the beam. Karen. She was waist-deep in murky water, standing on the small brick patio of her backyard, clutching a dog, some little white puffball, that looked equally terrified. The water was rising fast around her, and she kept slipping, nearly losing her footing. Her prim blouse clung to her, soaked, and sagging, her mascara streaked down her cheeks in twin rivers of black. I throttled the motor and brought the Zodiac around to her yard. When I got close enough, she stared at me like she wasn't sure if I was real. She gasped. It's coming from the hill." The water it broke through. I didn't say anything at first. I let the silence stretch just a second longer than was comfortable. Then I reached out a gloved hand. Get in. She hesitated, eyes flicking from the boat to my face, as if trying to decide whether this was a rescue or a reckoning. Karen, I said firmly, this isn't a debate. We've got less than 10 minutes before that corner lot collapses and takes the rest of the cul-de-sac with it. Get in the boat. She scrambled aboard, slipping once and nearly dropping the dog. I caught her elbow and pulled her in. She landed awkwardly on the deck, breathing hard, muttering something between sobs and apologies I didn't quite catch. I didn't know she whispered. I didn't respond. We weren't there for closure. We were there to survive. I pulled the cord and started backing the boat out. The street was almost indistinguishable from the yards now, and I could hear more shouting up ahead. The Montoyas, an elderly couple, lived 2 doors down. Their house sat lowest in the basin, and if the trend held, they'd be next. Hold tight, I said over the engine. We passed half a dozen homes in quick succession. 2 people flagged us down, and I told them to meet at my garage dry, lighted high ground. I'd unlocked the side door before launching, left emergency blankets and lanterns inside. I had a 2-way radio rigged to a backup battery in the kitchen and a solar panel on the roof that powered just enough of the circuit to keep the sump pumps and freezer running. I wasn't just prepared for myself. I'd been prepared for them too, for the very people who thought I was paranoid. At the Montoya house, I pounded on the door, no answer. I tied off the boat and waded through the waist-deep floodwater to the front steps. Mr. Montoya, it's Daniel Reeves. I've got an emergency evac boat. Please come out. A moment later, the door cracked open. Mrs. Montoya peeked out, eyes wide behind fogged glasses. We can't get him down the stairs. He fell earlier, his hip. I didn't hesitate. I pushed inside water trailing off my coat and found Mr. Montoya in a recliner near the living room window, gripping the arms of the chair, pale but alert. I carried him. Not with grace, not without effort, but I carried him down the steps, knees buckling with each one until he was in the boat wrapped in a dry blanket, his wife beside him clinging to his arm. By the time we reached the edge of my driveway again, 5 people had joined the temporary refuge in my garage. I helped them and checked vitals, passed out water, and updated Jason over the radio. Reeves here, 2 trips done. Got the Montoyas, Karen Delaney, and 3 others. Water's rising faster than forecast. Jason's voice crackled back. Roger. I'm sending 2 volunteers with a second boat in 15. ETA 20 minutes. You want us to hit east side or loop north? Or go east, I said. They'll need it more. Back out I went. Trip after trip. By midnight, we had 17 people inside my garage. Soaked, scared, but safe. Some huddled in blankets, sipping from paper cups. Others stared in disbelief at the water that now flowed like a slow, steady stream down the middle of their once pristine cul-de-sac. Karen sat near the back corner next to the workbench. She hadn't said much since I pulled her out of the flood. At one point, I noticed her phone glowing in her hands. She was scrolling through social media, maybe trying to find updates, maybe trying to gauge just how much of the neighborhood had been affected. And then I saw it. She turned the screen toward me. It was a video. My video. The one I recorded when her hired hands cut through the flood barrier 2 nights before. It had been uploaded somehow. Maybe Travis leaked it. Maybe one of the contractors had a conscience after all. But there it was. Karen watched it loop over and over. Her face crumpled. I didn't believe it would really happen, she whispered. I thought you were overreacting. I didn't gloat. I didn't scold. I just looked at her and said, nature doesn't care what you believe. Then I turned away and radioed Jason again. We had more houses to reach before dawn, and the river wasn't done rising. At 2:07 a.m., the 3rd wave of calls came in. By then, my garage had become a triage center, blankets covering the cement floor, dry clothes piled in a corner, a lantern rigged to hang from the ceiling beam, casting long shadows across anxious faces. My radio buzzed with updates from Jason's volunteers. Both their boats were now active, ferrying people from the east side of the subdivision. I was soaked through, running on adrenaline and muscle memory. My hands ached from rope burns, my boots sloshed with every step, and my shoulders screamed from hauling dead weight through waist-high currents. That's when the phone started lighting up. First my landline, then my cell, then the backup burner I kept in the toolbox just in case. 3 different numbers, which one after the other, unknown, HOA listed, and private. I answered the cell. Mr. Reeves, please, it's Chuck Dalton. I'm the HOA vice president. My daughter's trapped in our basement. The stairs collapsed. The sump pump Failed. We can't get her out. Please help us. I paused, recognizing his voice immediately. Dalton had voted to fine me, twice. Once for the barrier, once for what he called unapproved outdoor equipment after I'd mounted the portable floodlight on my roof. Where's your house? I asked. West Ridge and Covington, last unit near the trees. We didn't evacuate. We didn't think it came so fast. She's just a kid. I wrote it down. Stay where you are. I'm coming. Before I could hang up, another call buzzed through, this one from Linda, the board secretary. Her voice cracked. Daniel, I'm at my sister's, but my husband stayed behind. I can't reach him. He's not answering. I think he's in the attic. Can you check 23 Holly Ridge? I added it to the list. More calls kept pouring in. Voicemails, texts, desperate messages from people who'd once looked past me at HOA meetings, cut me off mid-sentence, or rolled their eyes when I asked about drainage funds. I'd been that guy for years, the one who didn't attend social mixers, who spent too much time prepping for disasters that hadn't come in decades. But now the river had come, and they were calling me, begging me. At 2:25 a.m., Karen approached me in the garage, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her clothes dry now, but her face pale and hollow. I should have listened to you, she said. I didn't answer. I don't know how to undo this, she added. I don't know how to fix it. I didn't have the energy to argue. And the truth was, there wasn't any undoing what had been done. The breach in the slope had turned into a landslide. A chunk of the hill had collapsed outright. The east walking trail, once Karen's pride and joy, with its stone markers and rose trellis, was now a muddy channel funneling water directly into the lower yards. This was preventable, I said flatly, and it's not over yet. She lowered her eyes. Can I come with you? I looked at her. Really looked. Not the perfectly composed woman from HOA meetings, not the disciplinarian from the violation letters, but a human being broken open by consequences she never imagined she'd actually face. I nodded once. Gear up. We loaded the boat again. Karen didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She pulled on a life vest, climbed in beside me, and held the flashlight steady as we navigated the new canals that had once been streets. The Dalton house was 3 blocks over, partially obscured by fallen branches and debris. We pulled up to the front porch, where the father was waving frantically, ankle-deep in water. She's down there, he shouted, pointing toward the cellar door. She was getting boxes before the power went out. We didn't know it was flooding underneath. Karen stayed in the boat. I tied us off and jumped into the current, wrenching the swollen wooden doors open. A rush of cold, foul-smelling water surged upward. I grabbed a crowbar and forced it wider. Then I heard her soft sobbing coming from the floating edge of the staircase. She'd clung to the support beam, half submerged, her feet wrapped in wet blankets, her face blotchy and terrified. Stay calm, I called. I'm coming to get you. In the end, it wasn't elegant. I slipped twice. She kicked me once, not on purpose, but I got her out. Laid her in the boat beside Karen, wrapped her in a thermal sheet. Chuck Dalton cried. He said thank you so many times I lost count. We moved on, house by house, attic by attic. By 4 a.m., I'd rescued 29 people. Karen helped each time, guiding arms, offering blankets, comforting children. She didn't complain. She didn't hide. She didn't command. She followed. The rain finally began to ease at dawn. The wind settled. The river crested at its highest recorded level in over 6 years. But it hadn't taken any lives in our neighborhood, not this time. Not because of the HOA, but in spite of it. By sunrise, the National Guard had arrived. They took over the evacuation efforts and set up temporary stations. Jason's crew coordinated with them as I handed off the last of the supplies. They offered me a cot and warm food. I declined both. I went home, to my slope. My barrier, or what remained of it, lay broken and twisted at the base of the hill. But in its wake was a neighborhood that hadn't drowned, because of a wall they fought to destroy, because of a man they tried to silence, and now because the river had answered for me. The sun didn't rise so much as bleed its way into the sky, gray and veiled behind a wall of mist and smoke. The aftermath of a storm is its own kind of silence, not peace, but a stunned, fragile hush. Birds don't sing. Engines don't hum. People move slower, speak softer, like the air itself is listening. By 600 a.m., the National Guard had taken over full operations in our area. Humvees rolled down what was left of the main roads, their tires sending ripples through standing water. A Chinook hovered low over the eastern sector, preparing to airlift a family trapped on the second floor of their townhouse. News vans parked at the edge of the subdivision, hoods gleaming with dew, satellite dishes raised like flags. And everywhere I went, eyes followed me. Not in judgment anymore, but in awe, in thanks, in shame. I stood by the garage, soaked through, eyes burning from exhaustion, as Jason approached. His jacket was torn. Mud streaked his face, but his eyes were bright. "You just saved half a damn neighborhood," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. I said nothing. I couldn't yet. My voice was somewhere buried in the fatigue. "Some of your rescues were caught on drone footage," he continued. "The guards using it for training. News crews are asking for interviews." I shook my head. Not yet. Across the street, Karen sat on a folding chair wrapped in a wool blanket. Her hair was torn. Mud streaked her face. But her eyes were bright. No, wait. Her hair was matted. Her usual composure stripped to the raw bones. One of the guard medics had checked her blood pressure earlier and cleared her for dehydration, but not much else. She hadn't said a word since our final trip out in the boat. At 6:37 a.m., a reporter finally approached me. Young woman, maybe late 20s, in a raincoat, with the channel logo embroidered over her chest. "Mr. Reeves," she said, breath visible in the cold. "Would you be willing to speak on camera? We understand you led independent rescue operations throughout the night. Some residents are calling you a hero." I gave her a tired glance. "I'm not a hero. I'm prepared." She blinked. "But the HOA, they tried to stop me from doing the very thing that saved them." "That's your headline." She hesitated. "Can I quote you on that?" "You can quote me on this," I said. "Preparedness isn't paranoia. It's respect for what nature can do when people in power choose denial." She scribbled furiously. "Can we film the barrier?" I nodded toward the slope. "Be careful. It's unstable. But yeah, get your footage before someone aesthetically removes it again." I didn't mean to sound bitter, but some wounds hadn't even begun to scab. At 9:00 a.m., city officials arrived. Code enforcement, emergency services leadership, even someone from the mayor's office. They waded through the damage, interviewed residents, and eventually requested a walkthrough with me. I guided them along what used to be the HOA Greenbelt, now a scarred gully carved by the flood. Karen followed 10 steps behind. When we reached the breach point, one of the officials, Deputy Coordinator Leland Grant, stopped dead in his tracks. "This was the barrier site." I nodded. He crouched low, examining the remains. Metal fragments bent backward. Sandbags split open and washed across the slope. "Looks like it held as long as it could," he muttered. "Textbook counterflow installation. Who designed this?" "I did," I replied. He stood up, surprised. "What's your background?" "Army Corps, then FEMA. I've seen over 30 flood zones in 11 states. This one was always on my radar." But the HOA didn't want to hear it. At that, Karen finally spoke. "We thought he was exaggerating," she said, her voice small. Grant raised an eyebrow. "You dismantled a functioning barrier before a Category 3 flood event." There was no defense. She didn't try one, just looked away. The next words weren't loud, but they hit like a hammer. "We'll be reviewing your HOA's charter under municipal emergency conflict statutes. If found liable, your board may face civil or even criminal negligence findings." Karen's knees buckled slightly. She reached out and held the back of a street sign to steady herself. The mayor's office rep stepped forward. "Mr. Reeves, we'd like to formally request a copy of any documentation, photos, or footage you may have from the days leading up to this." "I have it all," I said. "Timestamps, correspondence, drone videos, and the live stream of the contractors cutting the barrier." Their expressions changed. The kind of quiet shock bureaucrats get when they realize the paper trail doesn't end in ambiguity, but in ironclad truth. By noon, reporters swarmed my street. I didn't give interviews, but Travis did. He'd resigned from the board an hour earlier. His voice came through on a local broadcast, hoarse but clear. He warned us, over and over. But we let Karen convince us it was about appearances, not risk. And now, half our homes are gutted. We were lucky no one died. Back at my garage, I reopened the door. Inside, people were organizing blankets, sorting food, offering each other dry socks and hand warmers. Neighbors who never spoke before were now trading stories about the rescues, checking on each other's relatives, sharing numbers. Karen sat near the back, holding her dog in her lap. When I walked in, the room went quiet for a moment. Then came a sound I didn't expect. Applause. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. But it spread soft, genuine from the people who now understood what I'd been trying to say all along. I nodded, said nothing. I wasn't there for the claps. I was there to build a wall that saved lives. And no matter what came next, I had. 3 days later, the sun finally showed its full face over our town. A clear sky stretched tight above the battered rooftops and ruined flower beds. The water had receded mostly. What was left behind wasn't just debris, or silt, or the stench of rot. It was silence. A kind of collective hush, like the neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. The HOA clubhouse was closed indefinitely. The ground around it had collapsed in the flood, taking half the foundation with it. Yellow tape fluttered from the awnings like cautionary prayer flags. City engineers posted signs reading, "Condemned until structural review complete." No one objected. Karen didn't return to her home after that. A moving van arrived early on a Thursday morning, just as the first FEMA agents were making their rounds, and two men loaded her belongings in grim silence. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. No final statements, no closure. Just a cardboard box hugged to her chest as she climbed into the passenger seat of a rental SUV. She never looked back at the slope. I didn't expect her to. By that point, the legal notices had already started arriving. A class action lawsuit had been filed on behalf of multiple homeowners, those whose properties were most severely damaged due to the removal of my flood barrier. The firm handling it was one I knew from my FEMA days. They didn't take cases unless they were airtight, and this one it was welded shut. Karen was named personally. So was the HOA. So were the two contractors. Their defense: we acted under board authority and community aesthetic codes. But the law, as it turns out, cares more about flooding basements than it does about matching lawn edging. The footage I recorded along with the drone video from the HOA archives, which Travis quietly handed over, was the nail in the coffin. 1 minute of Karen's voice ordering the removal. 30 seconds of steel being cut. 15 seconds of rushing water breaching the slope. And the overlay of timestamps synced perfectly with weather alerts issued by the National Weather Service. The insurance adjusters didn't take long to act either. They'd seen this play before. Willful negligence nullified multiple policy clauses. HOA funds were frozen pending investigation. Board members were named in breach of duty claims. Within 2 weeks, a temporary oversight committee had been appointed by the city to handle neighborhood decisions while the litigation moved forward. That committee included me. I didn't volunteer. I didn't campaign. I was nominated by nearly a third of the residents, many of whom had once voted for the very people who tried to ruin me. At first, I hesitated. I'd spent years avoiding the politics of this place. I didn't want power. I wanted peace. I wanted to patch my slope, fix my deck, and maybe rebuild the shed that floated away during the second surge. But then I thought of the Montoyas, of Chuck Dalton's daughter, of the woman who hugged me in tears at the garage after we pulled her mother out of a flooded guest house. I thought of the way the neighborhood now looked at each other differently, with something like humility, with gratitude. I accepted the role, not for control, but for change. The first order of business was reworking the HOA emergency protocol. We scrapped the aesthetic clause Karen used to justify the removal of my barrier. In its place, we inserted a new bylaw. In the event of a declared weather advisory, residents may take reasonable and documented protective measures on their private property without prior HOA approval. It passed unanimously. We also created an emergency readiness committee, stockpiled sandbags, installed water level sensors linked to a neighborhood app, and perhaps most importantly, we agreed to implement mandatory annual disaster simulations. Everyone would know what to do the next time the river came for us, because it would come again. It always does. I also received an official letter from the city, a commendation for independent coordination of community emergency response during a declared flood event. They offered to publish a case study on my efforts through the state's Emergency Preparedness Board. I thanked them, but declined the spotlight. The real victory was quieter. It came in the form of Travis, who stopped by with 2 pizzas and a 6-pack one evening, saying, "I don't think I ever really listened before. Not until I had to." It came in the form of Linda, who helped organize a neighborhood cleanup day and stood by me when the new committee voted to repurpose the old clubhouse site into a green space and retention basin. It even came in the form of a note anonymous left in my mailbox. "Yo, thank you for holding the line for all of us, even when we didn't deserve it." 1 week after the flood, I stood once more on the slope behind my house. The land was still scarred. The earth hadn't healed. But it would. So would we. I had begun drawing plans for a new barrier, one twice as strong. This time, the city offered to help fund it. Not because they owed me, but because now they understood. Everyone did. And when I looked out across the neighborhood from the gutted street to the porch swings drying in the sun, I didn't see a disaster. I saw a beginning. I rebuilt the barrier line in late spring when the ground was dry enough to hold anchors and the sky was finally more blue than gray. This time, I didn't do it alone. Chuck Dalton showed up first, boots already muddy, a shovel slung over his shoulder like he'd been waiting for an invitation that never had to be spoken. Then came Travis, pushing a wheelbarrow filled with crushed gravel. By noon, 3 more neighbors had joined. By the end of the week, we had a rotation of volunteers, retirees, teenagers, even a couple from 3 streets over who'd once signed a petition against the original structure. Now they helped bolt down the steel plates without hesitation. We didn't talk much about the past. No one brought up Karen. No one needed to. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't revenge. It was something better. It was resolution. The slope was reshaped with the city's help. A proper drainage trench was carved into the hillside, reinforced with geogrid mesh and layered with erosion-resistant fabric. We installed a tiered retaining wall that curved gently with the natural rise of the land, allowing overflow to funnel into a new holding basin behind the old clubhouse site. The HOA, now operating under provisional oversight, approved every modification without so much as a question. I served as interim advisor on all structural projects related to water mitigation. The title wasn't official, and I didn't want it to be. The people knew. That was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low and golden across the rooftops, I sat at the edge of the new barrier and listened to the sound of the river. It murmured to itself just beyond the trees, low and steady, like it had settled into a respectful silence. That's when the Montoyas walked up the path, Mr. Montoya now moving slow but steady, with the help of a cane. His wife carried a small wrapped package. "For you," she said, placing it beside me. "It's just bread, pan de agua." Our way of saying we remember. I nodded, throat thick. After they left, I sat there with the bread on my lap and stared out at the land we'd nearly lost. Weeks passed. The lawsuits moved slowly, as they always do. Karen's name fell from lips less and less. Rumors swirled she'd moved to another state, was staying with her sister, had joined another HOA in a different community. But I didn't track her down. I didn't need to. Sometimes the river doesn't return to the same banks. It just keeps moving. At the edge of the subdivision, the area once designated for clubhouse beautification had been converted into the new Community Resilience Center, a low open pavilion with storage units built into the walls, housing emergency kits, weather radios, portable lights, and first aid supplies. A simple sign hung from a post. "For each other, from each other." Travis insisted we include a emergency-proof plaque near the door with everyone's names who volunteered during the flood and rebuild. Mine was on it, so was Karen's. Not in praise, but in record. History doesn't need to cheer you. It only needs to remember. 1 year after the flood, we held a gathering at the new pavilion. Not a celebration, a remembrance. There were no speeches, no banners. Just neighbors in folding chairs, candles in glass jars, trays of food from a dozen kitchens, and music from someone's Bluetooth speaker, humming softly under the sound of cicadas. Travis tapped his fork to a plastic cup and raised it toward me at one point, murmuring to the one who warned us. And the wall that held. I raised mine too, not because I wanted recognition, but because I believed it mattered to acknowledge that when people listen, when they stop pretending danger won't knock, just because it hasn't yet, it changes everything. We didn't build back the same neighborhood. We built a better one. One that knew walls don't just keep water out. Sometimes they hold wisdom in, and every now and then, a river has to rise to show us who we really are. That day we remembered. And that night, I slept for the first time in years with the window open, the sound of the river drifting in like a song. Not a threat, not a warning, just a current carrying everything forward.